Welcome and thanks for joining me. The goal of this video is to introduce and explore a topic which you will investigate more deeply in the rest of your module tasks. And our topic for this module is Reconstruction, the historical period from 1865 to 1877, when Northern Republicans controlled Congress and attempted to recreate a more just South after the Civil War. Many of these congressmen wanted to create a South that would look like the North, quickly becoming dominated by industrial labor and economy. So moderate and radical Republicans in Congress argued over what would this recreated South look like. But of course, freed people had their own ideas and demands. Freed people, freed person, freedman, freedwoman, these are all words that we use for formerly enslaved people. So our course begins after the Civil War. There are no enslaved people. There are no slaves. So if you want to directly reference people that had been enslaved and were now free, freed people, freed person, freed man, freed woman is a really great way to express that. So keep that in mind as part of the vocabulary as we move through the rest of the module. Before I begin talking to you about Reconstruction, I want to take a few minutes and I want you to explore a big idea for this lecture, for this module. If you were an enslaved person who was freed at the end of the Civil War, so if you were a freed person, a freed man, freed woman, what do you think would be the first thing that you did upon earning that freedom? I want you to take a moment and just think about that. What would you do? I'm going to drink some coffee. If we were in class together, if I had chat open, I'll put this on YouTube and then you can put it in the comments. I'd probably be seeing a lot of people saying, I'd want to find my family. I want to learn to read. I know that marriages between enslaved people weren't legal, so I'd want to get legally married. I'd want to leave the place where I was enslaved, leave the plantation, go somewhere else. Maybe I want to go to church, a Black church with a Black preacher that's not hidden in the woods, right? That can be out and public. And all of those and more were exactly right, exactly some of the first ways that freed people explored freedom, created freedom, defined freedom for themselves. So at the end of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, we're going to see a lot of Black mobility. One of the reasons that people are moving around is to find family that had been lost, sold away from them. And we'll see this in advertisements. I'm looking for Suzanne. We were last together at this plantation. Meet me back at the old plantation, right? Or meet me somewhere new. So finding and recreating, reforming those families that have been separated under slavery. Learning to read, of course, we saw an image of let me go back to the image. There we go. We saw an image of a young Black woman, a freed woman, teaching her mother to read. It hadn't been legal for enslaved people to learn to read under slavery. Going to church with a Black preacher, right? Going to a Black church in most Southern states, these had been outlawed. Black preachers had long been associated with resistance, including armed resistance. So creating these public Black churches and attending them became a really integral part of the communities of freed people. And these churches became and continued to be a place where people come together, not just to worship, but also to plan how to assert their rights. As we go through our course, then you're going to see that especially Black religion and Black civil rights are going to be closely aligned if we think about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, both religious leaders as well as civil rights leaders. All right, what else? Learned to read, found your family, left the place you've been enslaved, went to church. What about casting a vote or running for office? Again, we're thinking specifically about Black men now, things that have been denied to them. This image, it's a lithograph. A lithograph is a cheaply printed, very colorful, as you can see, poster that you could buy and frame and put in your house. And this one shows Black Union soldiers, of course, soldiers and sailors fighting in the Civil War. It shows Black politicians during Reconstruction, not just voting, but becoming politicians. And down here we see a Black family on their own land, in their own farm. You can see that the wife and mother is at home, just wearing a nice dress, surveying the land. Now, from our 21st century perspective, to some of us, this might seem really old-fashioned. Oh, well, the goal was that women would be in the home with children. You might say, like, that's not the meaning of freedom to me. Some of you might say, that's exactly what I want. But think about it, for hundreds of years, that role, the domestic ideal in America in the 19th century, had been denied to enslaved women. So absolutely, they want to get an education so they can teach their children, but they also want the right to hold on to that domestic ideal that many white women, not all, but many white women had, the right to stay at home, take care of their homes and their families instead of going out to work. Of course, poor women have always left the house to work, and that includes Black, white, and other women. So this might seem a little old-fashioned, but this is a new right that these women are asserting. I don't have to work outside of the home if we can support ourselves on this family farm. We're going to get back to that issue. All right, yeah. So these are the major themes that we're going to look at. And we're just focusing on small parts of Reconstruction. We're focusing on education as emancipation, economic freedom. What does that mean? And when we think about economic freedom, economic liberty in the 19th century, we're going to think about land as well as labor. And of course, an essential part of freedom is political participation. Who gets to vote? These issues, and that who gets to vote issue gets into women's rights as well. So these issues of education, political suffrage, economic freedom, they're going to be major issues that you focus on in your Reconstruction mixer as you continue this debate in character as real historical figures. Before we get into those themes, education, economic freedom, political participation, I want to first take a little bit of time to discuss the constitutional revolution of Reconstruction. I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler. At the end of this module, you're going to see that Reconstruction largely failed in terms of economic justice, in terms of education justice, in terms of suffrage. Ultimately, Reconstruction is going to fail and be replaced by Jim Crow. But we're not there yet. But one of the things we want to note was that despite these failures that we'll explore, there was a constitutional revolution during Reconstruction that fundamentally changed the federal government's relationship to individuals, fundamentally changed the meaning of citizenship, fundamentally changed the right to vote. So let's talk about those. What do I mean when I say a constitutional revolution? I'm talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution. These are all passed during Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, of course, officially abolished slavery in all states, neither slavery nor involuntary service, except as a punishment for a crime. And the inclusion of the except there is going to be the foundation of a deeply entrenched system of African-American incarceration and other systematic, long-standing racially biased policies. We're going to see that begin at the end of Reconstruction. We're going to see that begin in the Jim Crow South. Well, if we can't have slavery, but we can have forced labor from convicts, what if we created a whole bunch of new laws like vagrancy laws, really petty crime laws, made them punishable by extraordinarily long sentences, and then targeted African Americans, especially men and boys? We're going to see in the South and in places like Texas as well, these new prisons spring up after Reconstruction to recreate that labor system. 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. In the 1850s, the Supreme Court had decided that African Americans, free and enslaved, were not and could never be United States citizens. The 14th Amendment fundamentally changes the meaning of citizenship. It can no longer be based on race. It can no longer be based on what labor you perform. That it neutralizes those racial components. Now, we'll continue to explore this idea of citizenship, who is granted citizenship. This is the big game changer of citizenship. If you are born in the country, if your parents are American, if you're naturalized, you are a US citizen. And last but not least, the 15th Amendment gave Black men, not women, the right to vote. We're going to see political participation absolutely explode during Reconstruction. And then we're going to see in the South, Black political participation drop precipitously. Why? Because the 15th Amendment will not be legally enforced until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It's going to take about 100 years for this amendment to be legally enforced. 1965 Voting Rights Act is what does it. That Voting Rights Act, by the way, was largely overturned in 2013. So let's get back to Reconstruction. Let's head down to the South and think about, how is this going to be accomplished? How is this Reconstruction going to work? Well, the mechanism to accomplish this Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. What is the Freedmen's Bureau? It was a government body tasked with implementing Reconstruction, with aiding and assisting newly freed people in getting education, getting healthcare, getting on their feet economically, protecting them from the violence of the emerging Klan, which is the paramilitary arm of the Southern Democratic Party at this time. Excuse me. But the Freedmen's Bureau, even though it's going to be very successful in terms of education and health reform, it only has about 1,000 officers working in the Freedmen's Bureau, in addition to thousands of voluntary women, Black and white women, who are working on freedmen's schools, for instance. And it doesn't have a lot of legal authority. So for instance, it doesn't have the legal authority to do the thing that freed people wanted the most, and that was to redistribute land from those top Confederates, from the plantations, break them up and get them into the hands of newly freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau had no legal authority to do that. You're going to investigate that more in the Promised Land assignment that you have. All right, so what were the Freedmen's Bureau's successes? Like I said, education. By 1869, there were about 3,000 freedmen's schools functioning in the South for freed people. This is children and adults looking for this education. These freedmen's schools were largely taught by women, white and Black women coming from the North who were educated, and some of the Southern elite women. So we're thinking about Black Southern women who had been free, I should say, before the Civil War, people with a little bit of status, a little bit of authority, a little bit of money. They're going to be instrumental as well in creating these freedmen's schools for other African Americans in the South. More than 100,000 students attended these freedmen's schools. So this is a success of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was also successful in fostering and aiding in the growing political participation. There we go. Sorry about that little. Growing political participation in the South. After the 15th Amendment, after 1870, remember, that gives Black men the right to vote. Women don't have the right to vote nationwide elections anywhere. There's some local places where women can vote, so I didn't want to make a blanket statement there. But in the South, Black men secure the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. You'll think about in the Reconstruction mixer, why do you think a lot of Black women supported the 15th Amendment, even though it didn't give them the right to vote? After the passage of the 15th, we see in the South almost 90% of Black men who were eligible to vote registered and voted. That is an astronomical number if we're talking political participation. With that, the support of those voters, Black men not only cast votes, they ran for office. This is another lithograph, that celebrates Black politicians. One, for instance, that had been a formerly enslaved, a freed person who became a senator. Many of the men that were elected to office had already had a little bit of status in the community. We're going to see a lot of them were already free before the Civil War. Many of them were already educated. Some of them were preachers. Of course, the highly educated has some status. But there were men who were enslaved, were now freed people who became politicians, who were elected. But understand that there's community leaders ready to step into these positions, right? Okay, I want to give you some examples? Yeah, Frederick Douglass became the first African-American who was a presidential, confirmed for a presidential appointment, by the way. So we not only have elected positions, we have some presidential appointments there as well. This is an engraving from Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly is this very middle-class magazine. We'll come back to it again, depicting these early elections. And what we see here, you can see that they've depicted a working man. You could tell he's a working man because he has a hammer in his pocket, not subtle. Here we have a finely dressed man, right? Someone that already had a little bit of status, and of course, a Black Union soldier. Harper's Weekly in 1867 is really presenting these men as these are men that deserve the right to vote. And here we have an image of the 1874-1875 Mississippi State Senate. And you can see here the number of Black men. The junior senators are down below. That's why all of the newly elected men are down here for the most part. You could see the number of Black men who were voted into the Senate. And you're looking at this and you're like, wait a second, Dr. Seraphine, I see a lady. This is the Senate postmistress. That is an elected position. I do not know why, but in the 19th century, being a postmistress was seen as an appropriate role for a woman. I don't know why. So that's one of the very, very, very few elected positions that you'll see women in, being a postmistress. And it's an appointment with some status, or an office with some status. She gets to be on the lithograph right next to the senators. The first Black US senator, so this is the Mississippi State Senate. If we're talking the US Senate, Hiram Revels is the first Black US senator sent from Mississippi in 1870 and 1871. Like I said, this wave of political positions pushed African-American men to nearly the highest elected office into the US Senate. Let's look at a list of Black US senators since 1870. Wikipedia is a great source for this type of question. If anyone's ever like, Wikipedia is a terrible source, not for everything, for some things it's really good. Like I need a list of what African-American senators of the United States has had. Great choice to go to Wikipedia. All right, let me make sure. Oh, gotta get my little, sorry, I'm just making sure I've got my little spotlight. There we go. So list of African-American senators, United States senators. Of course, we've got, as we know, Hiram Revels from Mississippi, Blanche Bruce, also sent to the US Senate from Mississippi in the 1870s. Let's keep scrolling. And before I scroll, why don't you think to yourself, how many Black US senators do you think we've had since Reconstruction? It's been about 150 years. You think about that while I drink some coffee. All right, Hiram Rhodes Revels, Blanche Bruce. Edward Brooke. Oh, it's a pretty big time jump. We're going to 1967 from 1875. Also note that we've moved from the South, Mississippi, up to Massachusetts. Massachusetts will send the next Black US Senator. Kara Mosley Braun, oh shit. We are already at Barack Obama. That did not take very long to scroll. Roland Burris, Tim Scott, Mo Cowan, Cory Booker, of course, Kamala Harris, and Raphael Warnock. As you scroll, you're going to see some changes. One of the things you're going to note is general party affiliation. We're going to see a demographic shift among African-American voters towards the Democratic Party in the 20th century. Of course, people aren't just their demographic, so there's exceptions. Tim Scott, a notable exception. Tim Scott is also the next Southern Black senator after Blanche Bruce. So we go from 1875 to 2013. Then, of course, if we continue to scroll down, we'll see that Georgia has sent another Black senator, Reverend Warnock. One person is missing. You may be playing the role of PBS Pinchback in the Reconstruction mixer. You were elected, but denied your seat. You were never sat after being legally elected to the US Senate. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. Got a lot of screens going. And let's go ahead and turn to our final theme. So we've talked about education, we've talked about political participation. I want to talk now about economic freedom, economic security. Those mean subtly different things. And what would happen to the economic system in the South? Slavery was an economic system. It's also a social system, a cultural system, a legal system, but it is an economic system. What is going to take its place? From a white Southern perspective, and really when I'm talking about Southern elites, they're the top about 2% of Southern society that before Reconstruction absolutely dominated the South politically and economically and culturally and socially. When I talk about, I'm talking about planter class, people that owned enormous plantations and enslaved hundreds of African Americans to work. That's what I'm talking about. For them, their hope for how the South would be reconstructed would be that it would look as close to slavery as they could get it without crossing the 13th Amendment. And here we have a pro-Reconstruction cartoon that's really satirizing that wealthy Southern perspective, saying, well, the Lord says you've got to work, you better get to work. Of course, he's sitting on his porch, maybe having a mint julep, while this freed person, formerly enslaved, is getting to work. I have to let my monster of a cat out the door. Oh, you're stuck. You've gotten yourself stuck. Okay, you're a monster. There you go. Sorry about that. I would say I would edit it out, but I don't know how. So if this is the Southern perspective, well, we need a labor system that looks as close to slavery as possible. What is the perspective of the freed people? The argument, the demand of freed people is this: we were always loyal to the Union. We fought for the Union. We fled to the Union when the Union lines came close. We and our families have worked this land for hundreds of years without compensation. We deserve this land. This land, they're talking about the land of those top Confederates, or as you'll see others refer to them as, the chief rebels, top Confederates. They had a good reason to believe they would get this land. During the war, when General Sherman is fighting a swath through the South, in the Carolina Sea Islands, he emancipates enslaved people there and says to them, leave the Union Army alone. We don't know what to do with you. Stay here, keep planting rice. That's the crop of the Sea Islands. The Union Army will be back later to buy that rice from you. This land is now yours. For years then, during the Civil War, for several years, the Carolina Sea Island people and elsewhere worked the land that they had been given by General Sherman with the full expectation that they would keep that land. During Reconstruction, President Johnson took the land back and returned it to those chief rebels, those elite Confederates. This then is a petition from the freed people of the Sea Islands, a petition to General O.O. Howard, he's the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, saying, why would you return this land to your enemies instead of giving it to us, keeping it, protecting it for us who have always been loyal to the Union? You will see that without this land, without this economic security, it is not the condition of really free men. To understand that perspective, this is not the condition of really free men if we don't have this land. We have to understand that for men in the 19th century, working for someone else was not it. That is not economic security. That is not economic prosperity. Their economic system is very different than ours. In the 21st century, many of you are looking forward to a great salaried job. For you, that is economic security. In the 19th century, economic security, being your own man, meant working your way up to being a master craftsman and owning your own shop as an artisan, or owning a land that you could farm with your family. Both of these artisanal shops and farms are family affairs. That you control your time, your labor, your price. You don't go and work for someone else for an hourly wage. That's not it for men, especially in the 19th century. So freed people in the South, they say, we don't want wage labor. Freedmen's Bureau says, well, we can help you sign contracts. No, we don't want wage labor. We want land, because that's what economic security means. You'll explore this further in depth in the Promised Land, but I want to discuss briefly what happened instead of land redistribution. You'll explore why did land redistribution not happen, one historical argument, one historian's thesis about why that didn't happen. But I want to focus on what took its place. Instead of land redistribution, the South ended up with sharecropping. Many of you are familiar with sharecropping, but let me explain it just in case. Here we have a map showing the Barrow Plantation before and after emancipation. And you'll see, I'm here. You'll see that before emancipation, enslaved people lived in quarters. They were not really private places. They were not their own homes. After emancipation, people lived in their own homes. And that's one, if we're going to say, if we're going to look for improvements, there's one improvement, right? But that dream of owning your own land, of wife and mother staying home, that dream falls apart. Because these people aren't farming their own land. Lizzie Dalton isn't farming her own land. Frank Maxey and his family aren't farming their own land. They're sharecropping. Here's how it works. They're renting. Now, it's the 21st century. Many of us are very comfortable with the idea of renting. Again, 19th century, no, that's not it. Now, imagine that you've settled down back into the plantation where you were enslaved. And you might say, why on earth would anyone return there? In part because you've created a community among other people that were enslaved there, but also because your options are extremely limited, especially as Reconstruction nears its end. You don't really have any good place to go. People will settle in their own homes and they'll make an agreement. They'll sign a contract with their former enslaver that they'll rent the land for X price a year. And at the end of the year, they'll pay that year's rent after they're able to market their crops. If you're a formerly enslaved, if you're a freed person, you probably do not want to grow cotton, all right? You want to grow food for your family, but you don't want to be growing cotton that you're forced to do for maybe your entire life. But now you have a big bill to pay at the end of the year, so you're going to have to plant a lot of cotton with the hope of selling it. Now imagine that Frank Maxey or Joe Bug, they go out to the barn on the first day of sharecropping. They go out to grab a tool, but here comes their former enslaver and he says, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm getting the tools that I need to farm. Former enslaver, now landlord says, those aren't yours, but I'll rent them to you for a small price. All right, fair enough. You do your work, you go home at the end of the day, and your wife tells you, we're broke. We need shoes for the children so they can go to the freedmen's school. I need to be able to buy flour to make bread for our family. All right. You go back up to your now landlord's house and you ask the mistress, can we get a loan? Can we get some food? Can we get some shoes for the children? All right, no problem. You can owe me. I'll put it on the books for the end of the year. End of the year comes, you have a beautiful crop of cotton. You didn't want to grow it, but it came out great. But globally, the price of cotton has crashed. When you go to sell your cotton at the end of the year, you realize you didn't make enough to pay back your year of rents, the loans that you had to take out, the rents of the tools that you needed to work. You go back up to the big house and you tell your landlord, I didn't make enough this year. What does he say? That's all right. I'll add it to next year's bill. Sharecropping is a cycle of debt that entraps people generationally. And here's an interesting thing. The economic system of slavery was racialized. It was a racialized labor system. But the landlord looks around and says, poor whites, come on in. Sharecropping dominates poor farmers in the South, Black and white, for the next 100 years. And if we look at a map of sharecropping in the South, the darker green it is, the higher percentage of sharecroppers there are in that county. This largely follows the old, the Cotton Kingdom. You can see clusters around the Mississippi River. If we look at this map, darker green, more sharecroppers. And if we lay this map, this is just a map of the South here. If we lay that map over this national map, it lines up really well that those deep sharecropping counties become pockets of poverty. Now, this is a multivariate issue. There are other contributors to this poverty, but sharecropping and that cyclical generational debt, the inability to build any kind of wealth, the wealth of owning a home, for instance, of being able to pass down property to your children, with that removed, you see this generational debt. And we see pockets of poverty in other places. Here we have Appalachia. This is a deep pocket of American poverty that we'll find poor whites, Native Americans, African Americans in Appalachia. It's often talked about when we talk about white poverty in America. And if you go out here to the west, you're going to see these odd, really no poverty around, and then these dark blue counties. What's happening here is Native American reservations. So we'll come back to these discussions, this generational poverty, these pockets of poverty in America. A lot of this too is because a lot of people don't live out here. But these dark counties, we're looking primarily at reservations. So we're going to come back to all of these themes. Voting justice, what happens? Economic justice, what happens? Women's suffrage, education, what happens? These are going to be major themes in our course, and you're going to explore them in your first interactive role play where you take on the role of a real historical figure. Think about what were their lives like? What do they want? What do they hope for the future? What are they afraid of? And you're going to talk to each other in character in that historical role in the Reconstruction mixer. Then we've got some other things in the module for you to come back to see what happens next as Reconstruction ends and Jim Crow begins. What does that mean? As always, inbox message me, drop by Zoom office hours if you need any help. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and thank you for listening.